Welcome, everyone. My name is Robert Bishara, and today I am interviewing a very special guest who will tell us about her work, her father's work, and the history of psychoanalysis in Egypt more generally. Dr. Neveen Zewar is a psychoanalyst and a professor of psychology at Ain Shams University. She is the founder of the Arab Psychoanalytic group in Cairo. She is the author of at least 6 books on psychoanalysis in Arabic, such as Psychological Disturbances Among Children and Adolescents, as well as On Psychological Reality. And she has also translated Sigmund Freud and Mustafa Safwan into Arabic. What did I forget to include, Dr. Neveen?
No, I don't think you did forget anything.
Okay.
Maybe the supervision of my students on their PhDs and master's degrees.
Fantastic. So my first question, Dr. Neveen, is how did you get into psychoanalysis?
It's obvious. It's because of my father, defending the name of the father.
Okay. And why do you think psychoanalysis is important?
It is very important. Once you work and see how much it helps people to have a better life, you find it fascinating and quite self-satisfactory.
So please tell us about some of your research. I mentioned that you've translated some psychoanalytic texts into Arabic, but you've also published original research that I mentioned 2 books above. So walk us through some of your own research, if you will.
Well, I had a paper on female genital mutilation in Egypt, and another paper which is published as an article in one of my books. It's about Sufism and a trial of explaining what Sufism is with psychoanalysis.
So do you see a connection between Sufism and psychoanalysis?
No, I interpreted some of the verses in psychoanalytic meanings with psychoanalytic interpretation.
So what were some of your findings in that paper? Because I'm sure a lot of listeners would be interested to learn more.
Of course, it's very well related to narcissism and other concepts.
So what are your guiding principles as a psychoanalyst? I asked this question with the knowledge that psychoanalysis is not merely a profession for you. We've talked before and you told me it's a passion. So would you kindly say more why you think it's a passion and not just a profession?
Well, it's a passion and it's a way of life for me, at least. I don't know for other analysts how it is. But for me, it's a way of life. Of course, I lived with a psychoanalyst at home, and he was a very special person. He was a very peaceful person and very quiet. And in my thinking, that somehow psychoanalysis, if you were psychoanalyzed, you become more inclusive and permissive, and you understand life in a different way.
So it's a whole perspective on life, right? And it's a way of living as well.
Yeah.
So this next question is more about the history of psychoanalysis in Egypt.
Yes.
And the work of the Arab Psychoanalytic group in Cairo, or the Cairo group, which you founded.
Yes.
So if you want to tell us a little bit more about the history and then the work that your group does.
Okay, the history of psychoanalysis goes back way to the 30s of the 20th century, when Shukri Girgis, an Egyptian, who studied in London, returned to his hometown, Alexandria, and he started a clinic, but he clashed with the government for opening a clinic when he was not a physician. But the real movement started in the 40s, when my father returned to Egypt from France. You know, he graduated from Cairo University in the first batch in 1929. And then he was sent to France to study psychology and logic by the government. And he got his degree from the Sorbonne. And then he met with Georges Dumas, who was an analyst. And he understood from him that he should be studying in medical school to become a psychoanalyst. He was interested in becoming a psychoanalyst, so he veered into the medical school and he studied medicine in Lyon. When he graduated, he returned to Egypt and he was appointed by Taha Hussein to become an adjunct professor of psychology in Alexandria University, where he met Mustafa Safwan as his student and Sami Ali, who became, who were, just students in Alexandria University, and they were impressed by psychoanalysis, and they became, two of the very renowned psychoanalysts in France. Of course, Mustafa Safwan is very well known as an analyst in France with, he published a lot of books in French. And then in Arabic also, he was one of the first Egyptians to translate interpretation of dreams to Arabic, when there was a movement in the 50s to translate Freud into Arabic. Mustafa Safwan translated in the interpretation of dreams from the German language. So did Sami Ali. He translated 3 essays on sexuality. And there was a big movement of translation to the Arabic among Egyptian psychoanalysts. And one of them was not from the French school. His name was Ishaq Ramzi. And he graduated from the Tavistock Institute, and he translated on the pleasure principle. So there was the movement in the 40s for Egyptians to become psychoanalysts way before so many other countries. And there was this movement in translation to Arabic. Also, my father went back to France after the war has ended, the Second World War. And he took with him Mustafa Safwan to France to become an analyst. Thereupon, my father started his training analysis in France, and he was appointed as chef de clinique in Paris University until the year 49. He came back to Egypt, and he was appointed by Taha Hussein once again to found the new in the new university that was starting then, Ain Shams University, which was then called the Ibrahim University. He started the very first psychology section in Egypt, and he had a great friendship and camaraderie with Yusuf Murad, who was head of department in the Cairo University. And they published this a review. It's a review in psychology. And he published his 3 essays on the psychosomatic medicine in this review. So he also taught and supervised several hundreds of masters and PhDs, of course, mostly with a psychoanalytic impressions and reviews. And then, of course, I was impressed by my father, and maybe this was his desire, but now it's my desire to become an analyst and to continue his legacy. I started a group in Egypt, a reading group, and these candidates are being analyzed mostly by other Egyptians who live out of Egypt. So
it's a fantastic history, and it's amazing that you're continuing the legacy through your work, and you continue to translate as well. When did you start the Cairo group, actually? What year did it start?
Well, I started it like 20 years ago, okay. But it wasn't, well established. And I contacted the international through an Egyptian who lives now in Florida. Her name is Afaf Mahfouz. She's a member of the international in New York, and she helped me much. And at that point, the director of the international, his name was Perdigao. He came to Egypt, and I presented him in Ain Shams University, and he gave us some lectures. But he, he said you can only be a reading group. So I looked for other attachments, and then I worked on my own, all alone, maybe with the help of other Egyptians, but they don't live in Egypt.
Right. So you mostly do this work on your own, and you told me that you do some collaborations with a group in Lebanon, right?
Yes.
Oh, that's fantastic.
They're Lacanians. Yeah.
So the reason I asked about the history of psychoanalysis in Egypt, obviously, because, with the full awareness of that your father, Dr. Mustafa Zewar, is considered by many the one who popularized psychoanalysis, and not only in Egypt, but also in the Arab world, right?
Yes.
So as you know, in Omnia Shakri's book, The Arabic Freud, she does mention your father a number of times, but her focus is more on his colleague, Yusuf Murad. So the title of the book is in reference to Yusuf Murad, the co-founder of the Journal of Psychology, Majallat Ilm al-Nafs that you mentioned. Therefore, one of the points of this interview is really to get at some of the information left out by El-Shakri, which is why I wanted to speak with you directly, because how else would people find out, especially if they don't know Arabic, right?
Yes.
So any thoughts on this book?
Yes, I think she didn't have enough information. Maybe she had only information about Yusuf Murad. Yusuf Murad, of course, was a great person, and but you can hardly call him the Arabic Freud, because he was not a psychoanalyst, he was a psychologist. Yes, he worked with my father. Yes, he might have coined the Arabic word la shu'ur, coming from the Sufist Ibn
And that's the
Arabi.
Arabic for unconscious, right?
Yes, we as Egyptians like to call it la shu'ur. Other Arab countries call it al-lawa'i, which has the same meaning, but we like to, we prefer to call it al-shu'ur, as coined by Murad. But Murad was a psychologist, a child psychologist, pedagogue, but the real psychoanalyst is not him.
Right. So the Arabic Freud title should go to Dr. Mustafa Zewar. That's
yes,
and
because
I think,
he started the movement in the Arab world.
And he taught many students that ended up, becoming famous analysts, such as you mentioned Mustafa Safwan, but there's also Ahmed Faye, I believe, and others. So
yes,
it's a whole.
Sami Ali is very, very important
Ali,
in France,
right.
also. Yeah.
Right.
And there was another Egyptian who was not mentioned very well. His name is Haris Wisa Wasif. He is a psychoanalyst and a psychiatrist, but unfortunately he died very early in life.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I wanted to stop for a second on the translation of unconscious into Arabic for especially English-speaking audience, because la shu'ur, la means no. Shu'ur could mean like feeling or sensation. How would you translate, like, literally? So it's almost as saying no feeling or no sensation. That's how. And then la wa'i, la also means no, and then y is consciousness. So the other translation is basically not consciousness or no consciousness, right?
Yes. Well, shu'ur also means consciousness. You are conscious of whatever is happening. And this is how they coined it at that point in the 50s.
Yeah. Maybe it brings in affect more than cognition. That's my reaction. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like, why it feels more cognitive, like mind only, but shu'ur feels more like maybe psychosomatic. Feeling. Yeah, more like, yeah. Would you agree with that distinction?
Yes, I would. I would very much. You know, the Syrians have translated most of Freud and other psychoanalysts, and they had a
George Tarabishi, right?
Yes, George Tarabishi and others too. But yet again, they use other terminology in Arabic, other Arabic terminology than we do. But we Egyptians, we like to stick to our terms.
Yeah, and so there hasn't been an attempt to kind of unify the terminology in Arabic, in the Arab world.
Yes. Well, there's a lady in Tunis. She tried, but nothing has been done actually.
Didn't work.
And there's a great translator. He's Lebanese, but he also, his name is Mustafa Hgazi. He had been analyzed by Mustafa Safwan. He lives now in Bahrain. He translated the French vocabulaire de la psychanalyse to Arabic, but he used this, Lebanese terminology mostly.
Okay. So it would be interesting to have like a conference on psychoanalysis in the Arab world and bring up this issue of terminology, and because it would, in terms of scientific interest, it would make sense to unify it as much as possible, right?
Yeah.
One thing that we talked about previously, you pointed out to me that Freud references maqamat al-Hariri, or the assemblies of al-Hariri, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and I was very impressed to see that. I had to like go back to the book. I was like, wow, so Freud is engaging with this text. So what do you think is the significance of that? And if you don't mind reading the quote in Arabic, and I'll read the translation that I found for it.
Shall I say it in Arabic?
Yeah.
Okay, but this is the Egyptian Arabic.
Go ahead.
I will pronounce it in Egyptian. عرجت لا رغبة في العرج ولكن لأبلغ باب الفرج وألقي حبلي على غاربي فليس على أعرج من حرج.
So I looked at the translation by Thomas Chenry, and this is from the Third Assembly or Maqam, and Thomas Chenry translates it as such: I have feigned to be lame, not from love of lameness, but that I may knock at the gate of relief. For my cord is thrown on my neck, and I go as one who ranges freely. Now if men blame me, I say, excuse me, sure there is no guilt on the lame. So what is the significance of Freud citing this this text?
Don't you think, firstly, how fascinating that Freud has come to that these
Absolutely.
These absolutely fascinating verses. He actually wanted to describe the unconscious mind, how the unconscious mind would go find so many diverse ways to express itself through other, like dreams or slips of the tongue or jokes or whatever else.
Right, and the poetic sensibility here, I guess, captures that, right? Because Freud loved poetry too.
Of course, if you can read Arabic, you can appreciate the poetic beauty of these verses and other verses of Sufist Islamic poetry.
Mm-hmm. So my final question is, what would you like to see in terms of the future of psychoanalysis in Egypt or in the Arab world?
Well, I would like it to flourish, of course, and become something that is accepted and that is wide in our society. You know, in Morocco,
Mm-hmm.
it has flourished greatly, but it's because so many French are living in Morocco as Moroccans.
Okay. Yeah, so
So
there's a big movement there, you told me, I think. Yeah. That's fascinating.
There's a big community of psychoanalysts who are originally psychiatrists also, and mostly they were analyzed by Safwan.
So would you say Morocco is the leading country in terms of psychoanalysis in the Arab world, and then followed by?
No, I think it's the flourishing country for the moment is Lebanon.
Lebanon, okay.
Yeah.
So it's between Morocco and Lebanon.
Yes.
So hopefully Egypt can catch up eventually. Do you feel like there's anything we forgot to mention, or any important work or important names that we forgot to talk about? I just don't want to forget anyone. Make sure.
Yeah, I would like to speak a little bit about my analyst, Faiza Ali Kamel. She was analyzed in England, and she came back to Egypt, and she also taught at Ain Shams University. Actually, I was one of her students, and she tried also to to make things happen in Egypt, but there were not so many Egyptians who stayed in the country for the movement to flourish. Ahmed Faye left, Mustafa Safwan left, Sami Ali left, Ishaq Ramzi left, Horace Wasif died, and actually so many other people claim to be analysts. You know, some psychiatrists would come and say that they claim to be analysts just because they had a class or two wherever they were studying.
So do you feel these departures, those analysts that left the country had created a crisis of transmission in psychoanalysis, or?
Yeah, I feel so, yes.
Okay. Because there was a flourishing. Oh, one of the things I wanted to mention actually, and one of the aspects of the book, The Arabic Freud, that I really liked in terms of the history is reading about these intellectual salons that happened in the 40s and 50s, and just trying to imagine people gathering in these salons and having, you know, free conversations about any topic and bringing in psychoanalysis and philosophy. And it's just fascinating to read about that time.
Yes, actually, my father had his own salon until he died. All his students gathered around him, even though most of them were only psychologists, and they loved psychoanalysis. Then they had the salons, and they had, you know, intellectual conversations about it and other things. You know, he originally was a philosopher.
Right. That was his
Yeah.
bachelor. His bachelor was in philosophy and logic,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
That's
That
fascinating.
was his bachelor. Yeah.
And would you say, what is the most popular therapeutic modality in Egypt? Is it psychiatry or cognitive behavioral therapy?
Both.
Both? Okay.
Yeah. Psychiatry, of course, because it's, you know, they have the loud voice, and the propaganda for psychiatry is strong in Egypt.
Mm. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Neveen. I feel that this was a fantastic interview. I learned a lot from talking with you, and I really appreciate your time and your knowledge on this topic.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Hope to see you again.
Yes.
Okay.